Good morning, everyone. Um, Thanks so much for taking time out to join us today. We know we're running right near lunchtime now, so folks' stomachs are growling, or maybe you're working from home and you ate a late breakfast, so you're in good shape like me. Um, my name is Mandela Deskins. I am the advocacy manager here at Take on Wall Street. Take on Wall Street is a coalition of over 50 organizations, including labor unions, faith, democracy, good government, think tanks, academics, all united to restructure our financial system to work for white, black, and brown working people, not just Wall Street and the wealthy. Um, which is why we thought the conversation we're having today is so important. Even when Black Americans make the same financial choices as white Americans, their wealth is extracted by a tax system that is anything but neutral. Fundamentally, the tax code was structured by white male elites to build their own wealth while extracting wealth from Black families. And this is the tax structure that helps create and maintain Black American poverty that is linked to a plethora of negative outcomes. But it doesn't have to be this way. Today, we're excited to present our two panelists to help reveal to us the hidden racism, the hidden white supremacy inherent in our tax code, and how we can restructure our system to focus on justice and equity, true justice and equity, racial justice and equity, and give us some next steps to take away in our fight for a more fair, more just tax code. So joining us today, I've ran my mouth quite a bit here. Let me go ahead and pin our panelists, because you were here to hear from them, not me. Joining us today, we have Dr. Dorothy A. Brown, professor of law at Emory University and author of The Whiteness of Wealth. And we have Dr. Darrick Hamilton, director of the Institute of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School. Dr. Brown and Dr. Hamilton, thanks so much for joining us. And we really look forward to this conversation. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the spotlight from my screen, and you all take it away. Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, man. Let me lead with that, and also lead with some gratitude to Take on Wall Street, the project, as well as Americans for Financial Reform for hosting this and all the great work that you do. And then I'm going to beat Dorothy to say this, in that it is such an honor, such a privilege, such a pleasure to always share stage and be on stage with her. The book that hopefully will be the basis for this conversation is brilliant. I encourage you, if you haven't gotten it, to go out and get it. It is a tour de force. And, you know, people use that word tour de force kind of lightly sometimes. It's almost become cliche. But if one were to define what a tour de force is, a comprehensive examination through multiple angles throughout time with analytical perspectives linked to humanistic notions, this book does all of that. It really does. It talks about the historical origins of the ways in which tax has evolved and come to fruition over time, with specific narratives that really gets into literally individuals. So, you know, it's super well researched, but it's not just anecdotes. It links to an analytical frame as it relates to what the topic of this conversation is. And of course, Dorothy can say a lot more about it than I can, but I think tour de force is the accurate label. One other thing I'll say, and then I'll at least pause, which is we changed the name of our institute. The institute now that I direct, and I love this name, that's why I want to single it out. It's the Institute on Race, where race is a placeholder for identity stratification. Of course, in the US context, race has been an anchor by which we identify groups and decide on political economy. So it's the Institute on Race. And then here's the key word: power and political economy. what we're talking about today is about power, and perhaps one of the biggest mechanisms by which power is illuminated and distributed is the tax code.
I couldn't agree more. And thanks so much for the opportunity for me to be in conversation with Darrick. Um, one of the things I want to start with is telling you how I came to this work. And I came to this work as an accident. I went into tax law thinking that tax law had nothing to do with race. I grew up in the South Bronx. My mother was a nurse. My father was a plumber. I dealt with racism on a regular basis. I didn't want to practice in an area of the law that I would have to deal with racism. So I picked tax law because the only color that matters, I thought, was green, right? So I was working on Wall Street. I moved back in with my parents. I have an LLM in tax, a master's of tax law. And as any good daughter, I did my parents' tax returns. So I'm doing their tax returns and I'm doing my tax returns. I make as much money by myself as my parents did combined. Under my understanding of the progressive tax system, I should have been paying a lot more taxes. I was paying more taxes than them, but not a lot more. And I would do their taxes and I would always say, something's wrong. They're paying too much. But it wasn't that they were eligible for a break that I wasn't taking advantage of. Their return was pretty simple. I know the law. So their returns were accurate, but something was wrong. Well, I had a full-time job. I didn't have time to figure it out. Every April 15th, it would come up. But by April 16th, I was moved on to something else. So fast forward, 1991, I'm a law professor. And I'm teaching a course called Partnership Tax. But I didn't want to read anything having to do with that. So I picked up an article written by a mentor, the late Jerome Culp, and it was about developing Black academics, developing legal scholarship. And I said, well, this will be fun. It's got nothing to do with tax. This will be fun. And towards the end of the article, there's a line that says, how do you know there isn't a race and tax problem if you don't look? And I went to myself, what? Race and tax? Well, the author was brilliant. And every time I read something he wrote, he always made me think. So I said, well, if Jerome says it, I'm going to look. So I picked up the phone, I called him and I said, I'm going to look. And he said, terrific. Well, then I hit a brick wall. And the brick wall is that the Treasury and the IRS doesn't publish statistics by race. So I'm going to stop right there. Okay. They don't publish the data you would need to figure out whether the tax laws discriminate or disadvantage on the basis of race. Getting back to Darrick's power motif.
Yeah. And, I love the framing of getting into this work around some personal narrative. And in earnest, that speaks to the value of diversity and inclusion, that having that perspective of, seeing what your parents went through helped you pose the question by which to examine to advance society. That's the purpose to me. I would say that similar experiences. I think that, looking at, if I were to describe how I got into this work, I had the good fortune of parents putting, and this is not a pull yourself up by the bootstrap story at all. Actually, it's almost a tragic story because my parents are deceased. And I believe that a lot of the effort and stress that went into exposing me to elite environments when I was young is related to the fact that they died prematurely. So, but the point was that I'm trying to get to is I was exposed to private school educations at a young age, well over our head in terms of finances, but yet grew up in neighborhoods where it was predominantly Black and they didn't have that access. And I could see fundamentally that some of the differences in outcomes was simply resource. That despite all the narratives about pull your pants up and all that, that fundamentally that it was about resource. So hence that drove me into the work of becoming an economist. And this leads to my other point, which is my discipline has a nomenclature as if it's strictly positivist, that it's not grounded in values, that it's driven by facts, that these things are just natural evolutions of the way things work. It's not true. It is not true And again, the brilliance of your book, Dorothy, is you point a lot of that out by literally pointing out the stories of individuals that intervened in a way to generate the structures that we have today. So everything begins with a norm. Everything begins with a value, no matter what it is. Now, we can question what are the right values to have, but I think we need to at least accept that. Otherwise, we're being intellectually dishonest. That everything begins with some value of how we want things to be. And race has been inseparable from our political economy throughout history. From our founding, we have devalued people based on an identity, not because we're just simply bigoted, but for a purpose. So let me hopefully cue up things and Dorothy, maybe elaborate on some of that purpose.
Yeah, so I just saw a question that said, did I ever figure out what was going on in my parents' tax return? And I love that question because once I took on the challenge of looking at race in tax, I stumbled upon the answer. So when you realize, or when I realized that the IRS and Treasury never published statistics based on tax and race, I'd have to figure this out on my own because I was fairly determined and I wasn't going to let their not publishing the data stop me. I then went on a research quest. I would look for race data. I would look for studies. I would look for anything that gave me some information about how race impacted individuals income-wise or things like that. And I came across a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights study on economic status of Black women. And there was a line in there that said, married Black wives contribute about 40% to household income, and married white wives contribute on average 29%. Now, to anybody else, that doesn't mean anything. To me, it was a eureka moment because it told me, well, let me back up. When you get married, one of two things could happen. Your taxes could go up or your taxes could go down. And in theory, your taxes could remain the same. Most people's taxes either go up or down. Depending on how spouses contribute income to the household determines whether your taxes get cut or whether you pay higher taxes. And what that statistic showed me is if you were in a single wage earner household where one spouse contributed 100% and the other spouse contributed 0 or 10%, you were going to get a tax cut when you got married. We call that a marriage bonus. But if you were in a household where the income was 60-40 or 50-50, your taxes would go up when you get married. That's what was happening to my parents. My mother and father made income so close together that in my mind, when I was doing their taxes, it was a competition. Will daddy beat mommy or will mommy beat daddy? And it was only by like a few $100s, and it was dependent upon how much overtime my father got. So he was a plumber, worked for the New York City Housing Authority. My mother was a nurse and worked for a nursing home. And, you know, I'm rooting for some reason for my mother to make more money than my father. Don't ask me why, I did. And what I found out from that statistic was I need to get more information on how husbands and wives contribute income to the household. And I was able to do it at the university I was at Cincinnati. There was an Institute for Policy Research that did Census Bureau analysis, and it showed that when white couples got married, they were more likely to be in a marriage bonus household and get a tax cut. But when Black couples got married, they were more likely to be co-equal wage earners and pay higher taxes. Okay. And getting back to Darrick's point, how did we get this joint return? We got it because of a rich white couple named Henry and Charlotte Seaborn, who in 1927 decided they didn't want to pay higher taxes. And we got from 1927 to 1948 when we got a joint return. But the Seaborns are the reason why.
I mean, this speaks towards a practical case of why we need intersectional lens. And for instance, a simple comparison of a Black woman to a white woman is problematic because you can't separate people from larger family contexts. And the other point that's clear is that it's not an accident. This is not just happenstance. One, and again, you point to exact narratives of when it took place from an archival standpoint, but that archival narrative can only exist if there's a permissive political economy to allow it. So, again, I think we could probably write articles on the ways in which the tax code needs an intersectional lens that, simply thinking about people as individuals, particularly Black women in this context, is really problematic.
Right, absolutely. And, there are stories like that in every chapter of the book, right? Our homeownership tax subsidies date back to a time in the 1950s when the defense industry was gearing up, and white people in 1951, for the first time, white homeowners were the majority of Americans. And suddenly we have a tax break for when you sell your home at a gain. So we see throughout history, throughout tax history, there are policies and practices put into place in response to white experiences, right? So when we think about the tax code, who does it benefit? It benefits white Americans. Now, that doesn't mean every white American gets tax breaks, but it basically means the people who were designed to get the tax break are only white Americans.
I mean, summing this up a little bit, we have narratives, we have actions / policies, or right, of what the actual tax code is, and we have race. And that is another critical ingredient, because the narratives that exist around things like taxpayers' dollars, like that old phrase even. Tell me that there's not latent race in that phrase itself, about deservedness and undeservedness, who we can say the government should help, who's the deadbeat. These are all code words for race. Then we have the actual policies themselves, like different ways in which we tax capital gains versus wages. Can we offer a refundable tax credit versus a tax deduction? The ways in which you've written a great deal about this, the marriage penalty, the ways in which that works. These things are not accidental. They're values. And, one point that I want to kind of make clear, and you have so much, which is the tax code is a lot more than revenue collection. The tax code reflects values and power. The tax code is America's biggest fiscal tool. America, we look at any policy we have, the single most powerful one is the tax code. But oftentimes we give it a pass when we think about fairness, equity, inclusion. But we shouldn't. So let me cue that up and say, what role should Treasury have in thinking about how to redress a more moral economy?
Well, first of all, the Treasury should make sure that race and tax statistics are publicly available and should not rely on a single academic's journey over 25 years, right? So if I don't push against the grain, if I don't overcome the opposition, and I'm just going to pause here and tell you, Darrick talked about economists thinking, oh, there's nothing normative, it's all positive. Well, tax law academics think it's all class and not race. So when I come into the conversation and I start talking about race, all they do is marginalize, minimize, insult, rebuff. I presented my marriage penalty bonus work at a law professor conference, and the first question was directed at me, and this progressive, white, liberal tax law professor says, Dorothy, everybody knows your work is irrelevant because Blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes, right? So that's the kind of opposition that I regularly faced, when really the easy, what I said was, oh, so you want your kids to grow up to be poor? No. You want your kids to grow up to have lots of income that's either subject to the preferential rate or not taxed at all. So don't tell me that first of all, poor people pay a lot in taxes. Rich people don't. Poor people pay a lot in tax. So this notion that, Black people are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes, poor people pay a lot in taxes. So if it wasn't for my overcoming the obstacles in publishing this book. And to be clear, this is a trade press book about taxes. That's like miraculous, right? That I got an agent, that I got a book publisher who thought that there was a public appetite, a general audience appetite for this work. So if like 5 different miracles don't occur, The Whiteness of Wealth never gets written, and you would not know that being Black means your taxes are higher than if you were white. So Treasury owes an obligation to all of our taxpayers for us to know who's paying and who's not paying by race, by class.
I mean, I love it. Something where we should have ground zero is Treasury. Treasury should not get a pass when we start thinking about progressive policies, when we start thinking about race, when we start thinking about the country fulfilling its fiduciary responsibility, which should be inclusion, equity, and civic engagement. I mean, the fact that somebody can get a tax deduction and not get a refundable tax credit, there is nothing beyond a value of why that's true. There's no positive notion that, it's a negative sign versus a positive sign. And then whose money is it? It is our money. It's the federal government's money. So that also we should get the record straight when we start thinking about these things.
And I think that people think of taxes as this really complicated thing that they can't possibly understand. And when you listen to most people talk about taxes, it's really boring, right? So I get it. I don't want to listen to that either, right? So part of what my job is helping people understand taxes are, one, phenomenally interesting. Second, follow the money, right? Paying attention to taxes will really help you understand who's winning and who's losing. And as I talk about race and tax, I always say, if you find somebody winning, somebody's losing. And the typical winner is white and the typical loser is Black. So part of what I've been doing lately is reaching out with civil rights groups and helping them understand racial equity, racial tax equity is a civil rights issue. We cannot talk about fair housing, the right to vote, without talking about tax equity. So that has to be part of the conversation. And this idea that it's just so complicated and I'll never be able to figure it out is what people want you to think, so that you don't figure out what they're doing. Because if it's complicated, it's over your head. Trust me when I say it's not that complicated, because a lot of people have figured it out. It's not that complicated. You just actually need to understand it, right? So I understand it so I can teach it in a way that people who don't know anything about tax understand. If you are listening to someone talk about tax and what they're saying doesn't make sense, it's because they don't know what they're talking about, but they're using lots of words to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you brought up the concept of rights. I mean, currently we naturalize poverty and inequality as if it is the way things are. But the concept of rights and, economic rights is critical. Anybody engaging in any transaction with no resources, that's not a choice. That's vulnerability. That's vulnerability or being left at the whim of charity. That's what that is. So authentic freedom and choice has to include a grounding in resource. If it doesn't, then it's again, I'm gonna use this word, dishonest. It's intellectually dishonest and practically a farce. So, the other big point is that a lot of these outcomes that we have now are the result of policy choices, are the result of just that, a policy choice. Racism, I'm going to argue, is a result of a policy choice. And a lot of what we're talking about today, particularly with regards to the tax code, is government complicity in it. We can have the bigoted person and we don't like them, we find them boring, but the ways in which the private sector is able to accrue race power is because the public sector allows it to exist. So those are policy choices. I can pause here, but I know another topic that both of us are interested in and we could talk about also is reparations. So we can, let me just stop and see any responses.
So, what I was going to say is part of this notion about economic rights is what information do you have available to talk about, right? This goes back to data not being available. And if you want to talk about closing the racial wealth gap, you can't do it without reparations, period, full stop. Now, how we get from here there is a whole other question. But if you want to talk about how to solve a racial wealth gap that was created the minute Africans came on shore and were part of white wealth, right? That's how we got this Black-white racial wealth gap. And we're not going to solve it by tinkering around the edges. We're not going to solve it without talking about reparations, as difficult as that conversation might be. We're just not going to solve the racial wealth gap without, one, more people being informed as to the unfairness of the current system, right? So I titled the book, The Whiteness of Wealth, because as I was thinking about the racial wealth gap, I was thinking wealth is designed to be built in a certain way in America. And that way values, validates, empowers the way white Americans move through life. We can talk about historically and the Federal Housing Administration loans not being available to Black Americans, but then we're in the 21st century and now FHA loans can be insured regardless of race, but we have white homeowners who don't want to live next to too many Black neighbors, which means Black homeowners don't get as much out of our homes as white homeowners. That's 21st century racism. That is not 1940s, 1950s racism. So it's ongoing and it's compounded. And if you really want to grapple with how to fix it, you're going to have to deal with, shall we say, some unpleasantness. And the unpleasantness is telling the truth.
Yeah. And, the point about data is power, especially now in our information economy. Data is intellectual power, but now it has commercial power, as we're seeing the uses of people's private information and the ways in which people's choices even can be manipulated by using that information in ways to guide to a choice where really, again, it wasn't a choice, it was a manipulation. So I'm with you. And I think it's going to be a fault line going forward of another place. We talked about treasury, but data and information, if we want to ensure that there's not exploitation, but rather empowerment, has to be a focal point in going forward.
And one other thing I want to mention, while Treasury and IRS is doing nothing, the GAO interviewed me last summer for a report on race in tax and households. And they tell me that they're going to put something out in 2022. So I think it will be fascinating if the GAO, that isn't responsible for tax data, publishes race and tax analysis of households, but there's Treasury and IRS with egg on their faces. So stay tuned.
Well, I'm going to say get them because I know that's the result of your work. So good. And then on reparations, I'd say I have a slight nuance that might be a little different than your perspective in that there's median and mean wealth. And I think that it is possible to close the racial wealth gap at the median without reparations, but in the approach to close it, reparations is still necessary for a variety of reasons. Reparations is unquestionably the most direct and parsimonious approach to close the racial wealth gap because it targets the group for which doesn't have the wealth, and it gives them a direct mechanism of transfer in order to close it. No question about it. But as you also pointed out, the ways in which wealth is generated is wealth that begets more wealth. So there are ways in which the government could provide a capital foundation in a at least anti-racist way that could over time close it at the median, not the mean. And the mean is because in the United States, we have such distorted inequity regardless of race, but even inclusive of race. So we have a billionaire class that's overwhelmingly white, but still a billionaire class that exists that we need to address. And to me, that's one of the big reasons why we need a wealth tax, largely because they got too much power. That the economic power they have, it's naive to think that they can't control our political apparatus to prevent us in ways of addressing our climate crisis in order that they can get cronyistic gains because they own certain industries. So a wealth tax is necessary to rein in plutocracy and promote democracy in and of itself. But really quick, reparations, in addition to being the most direct and parsimonious way to redress the racial wealth gap, it does something else. And you certainly said this too. I'm elaborate. It changes narratives. It gives that authentic understanding of how we got here in a way that prevents the ability for us to characterize poverty and deficit behaviors of deadbeat dads, welfare queens, and super predators. It changes the narratives and in fact could potentially have a benefit to white people as well, because the narratives in which we define poor white people are very racist. We define them as basically being something abnormal from the right white person and basically like a black person. So both are necessary. That's what I'd say, because even if we address reparations in that one-time thing, we know what capital does going forward. It consolidates, it iterates, and we'll get the same problem 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 30 years if we don't have policies that breaks up that concentration.
So in the book, I argue for a reparations tax credit as a way to compensate Black taxpayers who for decades have paid higher taxes. And just think about, so during World War II, we had our taxpayer base expand significantly. At the beginning of our progressive tax system in the 1913 going forward, only the richest Americans pay taxes. 5%, 10%, only the richest, typically white Americans pay taxes. But during World War II, we needed more money. So most Americans then became taxpayers. And think about the Black Americans in the 1940s and the 1950s paying taxes for a government that was discriminating against them, right? So the reparations tax credit, my idea was to compensate Black taxpayers for that. But I'm also a law professor. And what I know is I wouldn't be able to, if assuming, that bill were to get passed by Congress, I wouldn't be able to get it validated by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would require not just that tax policy had a racially disparate impact, but that you'd have to see legislators passing these tax bills saying, I want Black people to pay more. And they never had to say that. They just had to make tax law that benefited white Americans. Black people weren't even at the table, weren't even thought of. So there's that. But when I think about reparations, well, let me just back up and say, so my second best alternative is a wealth tax credit. A wealth tax credit that would go to any taxpayer in a household with below median wealth. That means regardless of race, if you're below median wealth, you get a refundable tax credit. So if your bill isn't high enough, the government writes you a check. And I like that idea as a second best because of the racial wealth gap. 80% of Black households have below median wealth. So this wealth tax credit would disproportionately impact Black taxpayers. So it's my second best alternative, but it's one that would pass constitutional scrutiny because the Supreme Court has said you can discriminate on the basis of wealth, which goes back to Darrick's point about a wealth tax, right? We can discriminate on the basis of wealth, even though we can't anymore on the basis of race.
Yeah, and I love it because, again, this framework of property rights, it's an ahistorical notion. How did we get to the property distribution today, if not for malfeasance in the first place? So an overemphasis on property rights without an understanding of history is immoral. It's just that simple. Other points are if we in the past had race neutral policies that you described ad infinitum that obviously were racist in design as well as implementation. So going forward, if we're talking about an anti-racist infrastructure, then we should be intentional in the way we design policies using metrics like you just identified in your proposal. The fact that 80% of Black people are below the median wealth. That's better than using income, because you and I both know from personal experience, as well as many people we know, that income, education does not protect Black people the same way it does whites. But if we are going to use an indicator to get at some racial differences, let's use wealth. Let's use wealth as that target, because of the fact that wealth is a stored up attribute that reflects some of that intergenerational history in the ways that one's income, one's education doesn't. So we can be creative and come up with policies to redress our conditions. It is just, it's really will. It really will. Yeah.
It's, I said, I was giving a talk last week and I said, the lack of data from the federal government is not know-how, it's will to, right? They just lack the will to do it. And when we think about policies going forward, if you want to make sure that tax policy isn't making the racial wealth gap worse, you could perform a racial impact analysis. No tax reform proposal comes out of Washington, D.C. without a racial impact analysis, period. There are environmental impact studies that are done that are required by law. Why not have OMB require a racial impact analysis for any regulation or congressional bill? So there's so much we could do. The problem is people don't associate tax and race. Even people you think that are good on this. So now I'm going to turn to the ProPublica series, right? So people have been paying attention to the ProPublica series. There are these leaked wealthy taxpayer tax returns, and they've done a series of articles showing how billionaires pay really low effective rates of taxes, i.e., Amazon workers pay a higher tax rate than Jeff Bezos. That's like the wrong answer. But ProPublica ignores race. They will write an article that has pictures of 5 white guys who are the billionaires whose tax returns they're talking about, and not once mention that they're all white. Our system for building wealth is based on being white. If Jeff Bezos was Jamal Bowman, would he be the billionaire that he is? We know the answer. And it's true for every single one of those billionaires that's talked about. Tax reporters, suck when it comes to talking about race and tax. They are, and at this point, with my book being published in March, they're willful about it. They continue to ignore the race that's looking them in the eye when they have pictures that are just of white people, and they never mention, oh, is it a coincidence that they're all white? No, our system for building wealth is designed for white people to get wealth. Doesn't mean all white people have wealth, but the only white, the disproportionate people who have wealth are white.
I love it. Shout out Jamal Bowman in there. I like that. And then, also, if we value something, measure it. If we value it, measure it and put some accountability standards behind it. If you want race inclusion, score it.
Right.
Yeah, I love it. Maybe you and I obviously could talk forever. Let's bring Mandla Deskins back, please, and see if the audience has some questions for us.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. Yes, the audience has some questions, even though we were just enjoying those conversations and questions were just being answered organically. So I guess first, before we get into that Q&A, I would just, really like to thank you all for helping us to really gain more perspective. As someone who works in this field, I'm still learning to kind of restructure my perspectives to see the aha or duh or psh, of course, right? Moments where race is not considered and how that actually perpetuates racism within our discourse and our system. So we had some really good questions in the chat. So I think the main question, the one that is probably the one we want to end with, because I think that is a good pick me up, is, what do we need to do? So let's start with some of the other ones before that.
Okay.
So we all have been hearing about the Build Back Better Act, and the reconciliation package, and the tax provisions in there. And this is for both of you or either of you. Do you think that the Build Back Better plan is going to help advance racial and economic justice? And is it enough?
So this is easy. It's not enough. It's certainly going to do that better than the 2017 Trump tax cuts, right? This is a no-brainer. And there are provisions in there that are really quite good. So the permanent expansion of the child tax credit to earned income tax credit households is wonderful. The increased amount of child tax credit that will be available to low-income households is only planned to be extended 1 year. So 1 year is better than zero, but if we don't get Build Back Better, it's going to end like in a couple of weeks. December 15th, I think, will be the last check that families get, and kids don't go to bed hungry because they've gotten those checks. So Build Back Better needs to be passed. There are provisions in there that I absolutely hate. The Democrats are talking about removing the SALT cap. Y'all are in New York. I know high property taxes, but let me be clear. The people who are benefiting from that are higher income Americans. So we have a proposal from the Dems to extend the state and local tax cap for 5 years, but we only have a proposal to expand the child tax credit for 1 year. And for me, if you want to have a proposal that's not that progressive, and you want to have a proposal that's progressive, if one of those is for 5 years and the other of those need to be for 5 years, or don't come talking to me. So the Build Back Better is certainly a start on achieving racial equity, but it's just a start, and they have to do better. And I know the political reality is they can't do better until there are more Dems in the Senate. But to be clear, it's 1,000 times better than the 2017 Tax Act.
Yeah, I mean, only that answer was brilliant. The only thing I'm going to add, and this is with the goal of narrative change, is some context that, our good friend Dorian Warren reminded me that 20 years ago we had welfare reform. This is the 20th year anniversary of welfare reform, which was a shift in our perspective towards poor people can't get unconditional cash. We got to punish them, discipline them, and incentivize them to engage in good behaviors. Well, the child tax credit juxtaposed against that is a shift in public policy, however inadequate it may be. And by inadequate, we definitely need more. It needs to be made permanent. And what else I'll say is that the framing of cutting child poverty in half is not enough, because why should anybody be poor in America? Why should, perhaps the most wretched amongst us, an unemployed Black man, why should that person be poor? Nobody should be poor in America. And we can use the tax code in a way to literally eliminate poverty if we so choose. But to build upon and a framing that's useful, we've come a long way from a perspective of we can't give poor people anything without conditions to we're going to send people resources for the mere fact that having a child is expensive, and there are conditions that are affected in their lives. And we're going to use our biggest fiscal tool, the tax code, to do so.
And I will just say that Darrick is 1,000% right about extending the child tax credit to low income earners under the earned income tax credit is a sea change, because I've written about how we got here. And that was because of welfare reform, and Republicans in Congress said we have to prevent earned income tax credit children from getting the full benefit of the child tax credit because that's welfare. And the Dems didn't push back. So so imagine me watching this during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021 going, well, they fixed that. But I saw Manchin push back and talk about entitlements. And I said, here it comes. This is the trope that we give tax breaks to billionaires and we don't require them to work. But somehow giving a tax break to a low-income worker, we got to require something in exchange. It's just nonsense.
And we treat economics as if it's a dogma. So there's just a natural presumption that giving people resources will disincentivize work. Well, the lived experience from all that work that's been going on in Stockton and elsewhere is that actually it enhanced work, that offering people some resources facilitated the ability to get not just jobs, better jobs. And that's the key word. So.
Right.
So in that vein, especially that last part you mentioned about the wealthy and the whole entitlements trope that we see coming back, can you talk a little bit about the debate of taxing multimillionaires and billionaires and the racial lens of taxing the ultra rich?
Okay, so here's another ProPublica story. There was a story that said owners of sports franchises got these amazing tax breaks, and they were billionaires, and their tax rate was lower than the millionaire players. Here we go. ProPublica had pictures. The owners, all white. The players, almost all Black. And again, never mentioned race. Right? So in Build Back Better, there is a surtax on those who make more than $1 million of income, but that's going to hit the players. It's not going to hit the owners because the billionaires figure out how much income they want to pay themselves, and they pay themselves very little. So, taxing millionaires is, I guess, a step in the right direction. But I actually loved Senator Wyden's billionaire tax. That was really well done, really well analyzed. And I was talking to a reporter friend who, before the details of the billionaire tax came out, he talked to a bunch of wealth management folks and said, how would you get around this billionaire tax? And they came up with all these ideas. Well, when the plan came out, the reporter goes back to them and said, are you going to be able to do that? And they said, no. They couldn't figure out a way around it. Senator Wyden's plan that I'm encouraged by. So we had like a 2-day conversation when it came out. It's coming back, and we will get a Congress that will pass it and a president that will sign it. Maybe in my lifetime, but it will happen. And because the conversation around it resonated with most Americans, so it's just a matter of time for it to catch on.
Yeah. I mean, there is intended co-optation, at least among some actors, of this moment of perhaps goodwill that's resulting from the abhorrent cases of police malfeasance as it relates to, literally killing Black people, which is now more amplified because of technology that we see. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there is racial justice and economic justice, and there's overlap, but also some entity that's not overlapping. Like, for example, in any society, if we have a class of billionaires, they shouldn't demographically be all white. It shouldn't be the exclusive provision of white people to be a part of the billionaire class. But on the other hand, simply replicating a distribution of wealth that exists for Black people is not economic justice, and is also problematic. We have too much concentration of wealth in America, period. So that the hands of power amongst the few, I don't begrudge them because they have money and wealth. I begrudge the power and influence that it has on our political system. That's the problem. So we need a better functioning democracy that has at least not this extreme level of inequality that we have, because it limits our ability to redress our collective problems.
Thank you both. Okay, these are good. We're running out of time. Okay, I will try to take 1 to 2 more, and then we'll try to wrap up with the next steps. We might only be able to get through one, but
yeah, I was going to say, let's do one more, then we'll wrap up. Okay. I'm looking at the clock too.
Yep, no worries.
We didn't eat lunch, no,
basically.
Sorry, everyone. If it wasn't a pandemic, we'd be eating food and hanging out. Okay, so in this next question, in your book, you talk about how direct reparations payments to African Americans, the most effective policy would be ruled unconstitutional. So can you give alternatives bearing that reality in mind? And the follow-up was, have you thought about a constitutional campaign?
Oh, yeah. So my next book is on reparations, and I'm thinking about all of that. So thank you to whoever asked that question.
Yes.
I guess that's a stay tuned.
It really is.
And then, so I guess I would follow with, can you give us like some solutions? And I think you talk about some in your book, Dr. Brown, but, you know, also Dr. Hamilton, you know, we've heard about the problems, we have learned and expanded our perspectives. So now what are some things we could do about it?
So one, you know, never let anyone you're in the room with talk about taxes without asking the racial equity question. And if they don't have an answer, move on, right? So if you're talking to someone who's talking about taxes and not addressing racial equity, they're not reading the room right? They're not in tune to the moment. The other thing I talk about in the book is how should Black people be defensive players in a system designed for them not to produce wealth? So we know homeownership is valued differently depending on the race of your neighbors. If you're in an all-white neighborhood, then your home is going to be valued higher than if you're in a racially diverse or all-Black neighborhood. So as a prospective Black homeowner, what does that mean? Do you buy in the all-white neighborhood and have to deal with racial profiling, have to deal with your neighbors calling the cops on you, have to deal with your children going to schools and being targeted for behavior their white peers don't get targeted for? Or do you buy into a racially diverse or all-Black neighborhood where you don't have to deal with those issues, but you do have to deal with the fact that your home may not be a good financial investment, at which point I tell you, don't be house poor. Don't take out a home equity loan. Make sure you invest in your retirement account and maybe set up a 529 tax account for your child with the money that you don't put into the house because you're not spending more money than you regularly would when you're buying a home. So it's about being a defensive player and it's about working on changing the system. So I see those as parallel goals.
Yeah. And you know, I'm going to say there is no silver bullet policy, but there's a silver bullet framing, and that is one of inclusive economic rights, one of ensuring that there's a base level of resources that empower people to be self-determining. And we could talk about what those goods and services are and literally come up with policies that ensure that people have adequate quantity, quality, and access to those resources. So what are they? Baby bonds, and it doesn't have to be baby bonds. I get a lot of credit and attention for baby bonds, but the critical ingredient of baby bonds is capital. Having access to capital at a key point in one's life. There's some eloquence associated with a birthright where we can't impose upon narratives of deserving and undeserving, although we tend to, unfortunately, even to babies, but it's a birthright to capital. What else? Single payer health insurance, ensuring that in your most vulnerable position, you're not worried about finance at the point of delivery of medical care. So to ensure that everybody does not have that albatross of finance when they're really most vulnerable. We guaranteed income. So guaranteed income that eliminates poverty. Poverty is a policy choice. So we could literally we have a paper about this on our website, use the earned income tax credit structure by eliminating the work requirement, that's arbitrary, literally offering enough at a base level that moves families above poverty, and have the walk down related to what Dorothy proposed as well, all the way to the median income. So it's not just anti-poverty, it's enhancing incomes of everybody so that we can promote middle-class status. And the notion of taxpayer dollars, well, the tax code is our tax code. It is civic engagement that everybody is benefiting and paying as it relates to the tax code. So, I'm talking a lot, so let me just end and say that the biggest mechanism to implement this inclusive economic rights, and we got to add that word inclusive, because we got to make sure that it's not racist the way we design it, it's not sexist the way we implement it, that it's intentionally anti-racist and anti-sexist. So the tax code is our biggest fiscal tool and gives us the power to implement these things and should reflect our American values. And we have a monetary system where we can actually afford to pay for these things. And a lot of the contemporary conversation around inflation needs to be, in my view, shifted towards a discussion of purchasing power, because that's really what we should be concerned about, the ability for people to purchase the things that they need and in order to thrive in life.
Woo, that was good. I'm sitting here thinking, oh man, we're at 12 o'clock now. Couldn't the time go back right in the middle of this moment?
Well, this ain't our last time, hopefully.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
Look, I know I'm gonna be working with Dorothy, so
I know I'm gonna be working with Darrick, so we're good.
Well, we just take on Wall Street, just has to make sure we can get in there. But no, definitely. So I just want to pause here because I know you all are very busy people, as are our attendees. I wanted to thank everyone for coming out today, for taking some time to listen, to provide feedback and questions. We didn't get to all of them, but they were all very good. I put in the chat Dr. Brown and Dr. Hamilton's Twitter feeds, Twitter
handles.
Oh God, I don't know what the name is. What is it called? Sorry.
Twitter handles.
Twitter handles. I'm like, okay. Twitter handles.
Oh, you're younger than us. You're supposed to know.
That's right. I'm the old one on this. I'm the one that came up with it. What's going on, man? Look.
But your Twitter handles, along with the Take on Wall Street Twitter handle, we are having a conversation. Hashtag tax code is racist. And so we will, continue this. If you have some additional questions or comments, please put them there because we ran out of time. This is recorded on Facebook, so we will be able to share it. Dr. Brown and Dr. Hamilton, did you have anything you wanted to say in closing?
Thanks so much. I'm delighted that I was in conversation with my good friend, Darrick Hamilton.
Yeah, and I'm gonna try to be hip, fist bump, and thanks. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you all, and you have a good rest of your day. Thanks for taking time. Thanks everybody for joining us. Talk to you later.